Alright, today we're going to take a look at Unity for once. Those of you who've seen some of my other videos, you'll see I'm kind of focused on Godot lately, and that's going to continue to be the case. But this is something I made in Unity a while ago, and I think will still have value, so I want to get it out there. So essentially, this is a Git repo, which I'll also link in the description. It's for a template to basically make a Smash Brothers style selection screen in Unity. It's using their new input system. It's been new for probably 5 years now, but yeah, it's one of those things. It's their new input system. If you don't know about it, it's basically kind of like a lot of Unity. It's kind of a dumpster fire, and there's definitely a lot of capability in this system, but at the same time, it kind of bit off more than it can chew. It's complicated, so there's a cost to that. But anyway, let's get to it. So first, I'm just going to create a new project in Unity. And that's just for the purpose of like just setting up the first steps of the new input system. If you've never touched it before, this will show you how you would just get it up and running in Unity, irrespective of this input template that we're going to talk about. Okay, so here's a brand new project. So I'm going to just create a empty game object. This would be kind of like what you would set up as a manager. So first thing you would need to do though is get the actual new input system package. So I did that kind of fast. So in here, here's the package manager. We're just going to, up here, you'll see it defaults to packages in your project, which is not always very helpful. I'm going to switch that to Unity registry and then just search up here. And here's the input system. So we're just going to click install. Don't know why that says 1.3. I think they're up to 1.4, but that won't matter. This is just to show the quick setup. All right, here it just says basically there's stuff I need to do in order to actually use this. Sure, do it. Wouldn't be very helpful otherwise. So yeah, save whatever you're going to do. All right, now it's going to actually restart Unity in order to basically, in order to activate those things that it just did. All right, so here it is again. So now if I go back to project, you see input system here, currently installed. That's great. So in order to, one thing you would typically do in the new input system is you'll add this player input manager, and it came right up for me here since I had that typed in. Send messages is just kind of basically you call a method based on text. It's defined as a text string, so I usually switch that to Unity events. There's plenty of information on that. So if you go to invoke Unity events, then expand this. So like this is an example. Whenever a player joins or leaves, you can hook up a method that you want to run. Maybe it's just logging or do whatever you want to handle there. So join behavior down here, join when a button is pressed. That's a configuration. It's kind of a default workflow Unity gives you, so that if you have controllers hooked up and you press a button on the controllers, it'll automatically join that player. The thing I don't like about it, I mean it's cool, but you put the player prefab in here. So if you want your different players to not all be the same game object, which typically I think you do, then this kind of falls down is the problem, but it is good to demonstrate. So if you had a prefab, drag it in here, then you can test it out by pressing a button and it would spawn that prefab. And then here I think you can also have it spawn them in split screen. So if you're doing that type of a workflow, that might be useful to you. But for what I'm doing in that input template is I'm doing join players manually. A very key point about this new input system is what this actually means is you will create a player input component. So if you have an object that's actually your player, this player input component, the creation of that component is what's defined as adding a player for this input system. So we're not actually going to do that, obviously. That's just the manager object. One other thing that's worth mentioning, if you're setting this up as you want to use a UI, we're going to add a canvas to this. So Unity, like most, has its own actions that are kind of ready to go as far as UI is concerned, like UI, an action map for UI, things like pressing up or down will do something on your canvas if you want. So if you were going to actually set this up, it will automatically create an event system if you add a canvas, which is fine. But one thing I don't know why this is still something you have to do manually, but if you have that new input system installed and activated in that package manager, you'll see it warns you here, you are using standalone input module, blah, 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 blah. Basically saying it's not going to work with the new input system. Would you like to replace it with the thing so it does work? So yes, I would. So that's a bit of a gotcha that's been there for years. And like I said, I don't know why they don't automatically do that when you install the package, but they don't. So if you're doing UI stuff and hooking up an event system, beware of that. Okay, so now let's go over to the project that I made here. I'm going to drag that over. So this is the actual project that's on that GitHub repo, and again, I will put a link to that so you don't have to recreate this entire thing, but there's a little to it, so I'm going to go through it at least at a high level, or maybe a little lower than high level, so that, it's a little easier to understand. So let's just show this. I'm gonna see if I can put it in 2D to actually show. It doesn't really matter, so I'll hit play. So I have just a typical Logitech controller. I'm going to press the B button on it, and here we have this appears, and the control stick will move this around. So then if I stop here and I press the button, I mean, you can't tell, but I'm now pressing the control stick and it won't do that. So if I press it again, it's going to unselect it. So this way you have the ability to tentatively select or deselect until everybody's set. So in this case, I'm just doing one. So if I press this and then I press start, that's what kicks it off, and you'll see like, whoa. So then now I have the control stick. I'm moving this cube around because that's the one I picked, and that will also work if you have multiple controllers hooked up. It'll the same would be true. Those will control whatever objects they picked in the next scene. So how that's done is I'm going to go through the scripts here. Like I said, at least at a basic level. So we have here, it's basically, it starts off as an empty, but it's an object to hold the player input manager. So you see the player input manager here, invoke Unity events, join players manually, like we saw in the just dummy setup project. I set this to limit number of players to 8 because I only made 8 cursors, and that's more than enough for local. In most cases, I hope anyway, unless someone's got a Mario Super Party where they can, anyway. And then these scripts are just all controlling the behavior, and they're just all attached to this. Excuse me, this is one in the scene, I should say. They're all attached to this object. And then we also have, so these cursor prefabs. The part that I created here is the cursor behavior script, which I'm going to show. And note that they have a player input component added to them. So in this case, obviously, I do have a canvas. So when you do this, obviously, you will take your main camera or whatever camera and drag it in here. A thing I want to emphasize is screen space camera. If you use screen space overlay or world space, this is not really going to scale nicely. Like when you look at it when you press play, and the scale is going to be very different. I don't know all of the details behind that, but basically screen space camera makes it so that these, in the 2D view, those objects back there are going to appear to be the correct size, just as if you were playing with them. And the goal of that is you want to use see the prefabs over here. You want to use the same prefab in the selection screen as you do in the actual game level that you're hopefully going to. That way you don't have to try and, create relationships between objects or something like that. Like this is literally the object that's going to be in your game scene when you actually get there. So let's dig into the code just a little bit. So again, most of these scripts are on that main object here. So you see the player input manager is just the Unity component. Keep alive is just a singleton so it persists across scenes. And the scene initialization, player object handler, and gamepad join behavior are scripts that I created that are going to do what they say, we hope. So right here we're keeping track of a few things, like there's the canvas, the number of active players when it starts. This is actually a code snippet from the documentations quite a while ago. It's listening for a button press on any game controller type device. So whenever a button is pressed on any attached device, then it's going, you're basically firing this method off and passing in the device that that the button pressed on. So in this case, this is used to spawn the cursor, and just to create it in the first place. And also it's going to add a player, with that player input component on the player object, in this case the cursor. And then we're just saying if the device is the device that was attached to that player, then don't spawn another cursor for the same player. That's all that's really doing. And in my case here, this is to prevent it from adding a device if it's not a gamepad or joystick. The reason even I added joystick, because that's not really a gamepad either, but there are unfortunately a lot of aftermarket controllers. The one in my case, I have a Super Nintendo controller that has a USB cable, so you can hook it up to your PC. But it's a cheap Chinese manufactured controller and gets recognized as a joystick because it's kind of like they're shoving whatever controller board they've got into the form factor for the Super Nintendo controller. And you'll find that can happen. So that's why I even included joystick at all. So this is just saying the player number is going to be one more than the ones that already exist. Pretty straightforward there. Control scheme is just like joystick, gamepad. Whether it's set up for a for a layout of whatever type. So this is the player cursor. We're going to instantiate one of the player cursor prefabs, and the way this is done is by taking that player number we got and match it up to the name of the prefab. That's just how I do it here. So that's why these are named P1 cursor, P2 cursor, etc. That's important to keep straight, so that way we have a way to tie the number. There's probably a better way to do that, but I digress. So this is so if that player cursor is not active in the hierarchy, then we're going to create that player input component. And this is another thing that may not be intuitive. So Unity has an instantiate method to whenever you're spawning any prefab into a scene. Player input has its own instantiate method, which is why this prefix. So player input dot instantiate your prefab. I forget what this flag is, but don't worry about it. Just a no particular control scheme, some other flag I forgot, and the device, meaning your controller. So this is what's going to instantiate the player cursor and associate it with that device. These I'm not actually using, but these are what I was talking about on that player input, the player input manager. So in the events here, when you've got player joined event or player left event, that's what I just use for debugging. So you can wire that up to like whatever script and then have this debug and show you how many number of active players. So let's go over to this player object handler now. This script is all about the tricky business, in my opinion, which was maintaining the relationship between the player objects and the controller devices and persisting them across the scene. That can be a real bear with Unity. So that's why these are set up as dictionaries. So int is going to be the player number, and here we're storing the input device. And similarly down here, the selection names, which are going to correspond to the game objects that they pick. So these things, sphere, capsule, cube, whatever I named it. I think it's just selectable player, whatever. And control schemes. So in the event that you had different ones, you could theoretically put a keyboard in here, so then you would want to persist that control scheme if you did want to expand it that way. And this is This is not something I was actually using, but if you wanted to persist the cursors themselves to the next screen and you had multiple select screens, this could be expanded so that you use that to store them. This doesn't need to be serialized, but basically these are, so when you load the scene up, you don't want it to spawn them every time there's a scene change, which is how I actually do it. So this just keeps track of if it should spawn all of your players. So when everybody's got something selected and then someone presses start, that's where this comes in. So like the done selecting fires off that event, and that way we know time to move to the next scene. And so yeah, here's the method that actually runs when that happens. This is a check to make sure that every player has selected an object, and right here, so like it's going to check through all of the player cursors, and again I use a tag for that here, so I should point that out. So these are the prefabs, and these are, I forgot what the word is, they're all derived off this one. So here you have tag player cursors, just like the layers, you can add a tag, so that way it goes through any of the player cursors that are in the scene, and if the object selected, and what this is doing is there's the cursor behavior is attached to the cursor. So what it's looking for is to check this variable, which is set based on when they press the button, and making sure that all of them have this as true. So if it's not true for any of these in this loop, it's gonna balk and say, hey, they haven't selected the players. And that's something easy to check just now. So if I press a button, here's my cursor, and I haven't selected anything, I'm going to press start, and you'll see down here in debugging, object has not selected a player. Yeah, the object hasn't darned that object. So what this section here is going to do is store the information in these dictionaries we talked about, and, so we can persist them to the next scene. So these are all the dictionaries where we're taking the player index, the player number, and then storing the device. We're going to add the name of the game object they selected into that dictionary. And the control schemes, again, usually it's going to probably be the same thing or just a blank control scheme, but it would, if you had different ones, if you had keyboard and joystick, it would store that as well. So right here, this is where that variable comes into play, what we talked about before. If they've just pressed start and everything checks out, we've now stored the relationships in these dictionaries. So now we're going to set should spawn selected players to true, so that way when we fire that event off, it's going to spawn the players in the in the new scene, which we'll get to over here. And this is if you wanted to keep the cursors. I set it to false here because I didn't want to do that. And then this just loads the gameplay test scene, which is the one where I just moved that cube around. So this scene initialization, again based on that event. So this is a Unity event. So whenever the active scene changes, it's looking to see if that spawn selected players has been set, and if so, then it's going to spawn the selected players. So we don't necessarily want that anytime an active scene changes. For example, if if you're just going to the title screen and you got to the selection screen, don't do it there. So again, this is just between the selection screen and your theoretical game screens, but that's how you would use it if you were to actually more implement it into a project. The player key is going to be, as you see the little pop-up here, the key is going to be the number of the player. So this is just looking up the dictionary and returning the game object selected, the controller scheme, whatever it is, it's returning it by that player key from what we just stored. So this player selection names, hovering over here, you'll see it, I made this a dictionary that returns a list of player objects. I don't really need that for this example project, but again, this is the extensibility aspect you might want to associate or at least have a record of while you're processing. if you had more than one game object that you wanted to associate. So for example, if you had a player and a sword, which I think I mentioned in the comments somewhere, then you can associate those objects when you instantiate them here, or if you don't want to actually act on it, at least you have a reference so you don't have to try and look it up later. So right here, this is only activate the player input component on the first object, because you don't want to create a separate player for each object. You just want to create the player on the main object, whatever that ends up being. And here again we see that same method, player input dot instantiate, not just instantiate. And again, this is what's creating the existence of the player, except now it's doing it in the scene we've just transferred to. And instead of applying it to the cursor, it's now going to be applying it to the game object that we selected from the last scene, as we've retrieved it from that dictionary. So one little thing that got a little tricky here is the selectable player. So this is important detail. You'll see these prefabs, which are the selectable players themselves back here, these jobbies. They'll have a player input component, but obviously if in this scene I have a player input component, that's going to define it as a player. We don't want redundant players. That wouldn't work. The players in this scene are just the cursors. So that's why this is unchecked here. The prefab has these the default as the player input component exists, but it's unchecked. That way it does not create a player here. So that is, like I said, that is a critical piece of it. So what's happening here is this method sets that player input component to active. So it's good practice anyway to not expose too much and have your scripts accessing each other all over the place. So what we're doing here is this is the player control script, which is attached to those player objects, like the capsule or whatever. And what this is the method that gets called. So it's just checking for null here, and then if it's as long as it's not already there, it sets it to the activation which you just pass in. So obviously in this case it's true. So you might, you could use that to disable that too, and you might need that. But this enables that. So once we've created this player in the new scene, this is going to enable that player input, and again, therefore just create the actual player instance. So now Unity's recognizing it as a player and linking all that stuff up. So that's right. So that's right here. And even though what I was saying is it's good practice to access this from within here, so you're not trying to, by accident or on purpose, set this variable from another script. But I think I was bad, and I actually did try to do that, and I ran into a mess anyway. So this is not, in this case, just good practice, but it may even be required. So moving on here. So that you've basically created the player there. And this is an important one. This method is just to explicitly, in code, do what a lot of those templates are doing for you. I don't quite get why it has to be this input user as opposed to the player input component. But anyway, basically you take that input user that you get from the player input component and pair it with the device. And this is just an option to unpair a device if it was already paired with that. So this is explicitly making sure that character that you selected is paired with that controller. I should be clicking the other way around, but yeah. And like I said, that is a big piece of what makes this finally work. And this is just so, like I said, I haven't even tested this far, but this would basically instantiate the other objects if you didn't have just one single game object that you wanted your player to be associated with. So the cursor behavior, this is kind of the easy stuff at the end here. This is just the behavior when you've when you've pressed the button and the cursor's floating around the canvas. So all this world to viewport point is a important piece of that. It takes the position of the cursor and basically translates it for the canvas, and probably that world space that I was talking about matters here too. this just checks for if the cursor is at the edge of the screen and makes sure you're not able to go off of it. And we can just quickly show that. So when I go down here, it won't let me go further than this, and you can set that threshold. Like I set it just so, you know, that's about how much. If you set it more, you can go a little like halfway off the screen, but that's just whatever you want it to be. And this just moves the cursor. So on cursor move, so the new input system, I keep saying new as if it is, the Unity events, I should clarify. Let's go to a cursor. So when you select, again up here, when you say invoke Unity events in the player input manager, and you'll see it here on the player input as well. So when you do that, you can expand this events, and these are just from your action maps. You can select whichever one. So what you do to put your own methods to essentially is you grab the, you know, in this case would be whatever object, you know, player one cursor, and then any scripts attached to that will be options here. So you've got cursor behavior, which is my script, and on cursor move. So you select the event that you want to fire when the move action you know, is triggered. And the same down here for submit and start. So that's where this comes from, is on cursor move, on select button. These methods, once you create them, will show up once you attach that script to that object. So, and all this is really doing is does the ray casting here. So on the select button, it's not like select, and start, just I should say submit here. But selecting a character is what I was thinking. So when you do that, again, that Unity events, it will offer to pass in this callback context. And then context phase, this is just the input action. Basically what happened, you know, whether you lifted up on the button, whether you held down the button. There are a couple different, you know, things you can do with that. But so starter will get you the button press is basically what that's doing. And then we do the ray cast, and the key point, and basically this will return true if the ray cast hits a target. This part here is restricting it to that player object's layer, so that any of those objects here that you have selected as that layer, so it's only going to return true if the object that the ray hits is on this layer. Vector 3 forward, you know, that's important. Then we're, you know, shooting forward from the canvas here. Other than that, it's pretty standard. You know, if it returns true, it's going to put the target out, means it's going to set whatever it hits to that variable. So that's why you have to define that here first. So the raycast hit is the type and then target. So that way, because without that variable there, it wouldn't be able to write to that. So then you just manipulate if the object is selected, which we briefly touched on before, a variable that's going to be checked before they're allowed to press start and advance to the next scene. And this here just deselects it if it was already selected. So if they change their mind, you want to pick Bowser instead of Mario. And then on start button, this is where we fire that done selecting event. So right here is where we actually define it. This just defines the event, and then this is a kind of a shorthand way to invoke the event. And then event args, we're not passing any arguments, so we just put event args empty. And as long as that other script is subscribed to this event, that's where we can, which is done right here. So like on enable, you subscribe to that event here. And this is, so when you disable, you should unsubscribe. That's good practice. There are a couple of gotchas that go with that. And then that's what fires this player's done selecting method. And then this is the behavior we talked about before, where it'll store all of the players in the dictionaries, and then it'll advance to the next scene.